What to play today? I guess I could give The Last of Us Part 2 another go. After all, it has been a while since I've played that. Or I could finally get around to finishing Ghost of Tsushima. After all, I do have a PS5 now and it supposedly plays a lot better. Huh? What was that? What? It's been 3.5 years since I've reviewed one of your games and you'd like me to review another one? But I'm not in the mood for a cartoony baby game like the ones that you're in. I think I would remember if I had heavily implied that I was going to review Bust-A-Move 2. You must be mistaken, I'm afraid. Wait a minute. There's something missing from here. What's that you've got there, bub? Bust-A-Move, huh? Interesting. Huh, I guess you're right. I did say I was going to review it. Well, fair enough then. Let's give it a whirl. Hello and welcome to this review of Bust-A-Move 2 Arcade Edition for the PS1. This game was actually originally an arcade game called Puzzle Bobble 2, released in Japan, but then the European and American versions of the game got called Bust-A-Move for some reason. I don't really know why they changed the name like that. I actually prefer the name Puzzle Bobble because it makes it more obvious it's a Bubble Bobble spin-off and that it's a puzzle game, whereas the name Bust-A-Move makes it sort of sound like a dancing game or something. Either way though, as a big Bubble Bobble fan, I figured it was about time that I gave this game a look, because I've been meaning to for about 3.5 years now. So, there's no time like the present. Let's get on with it. The year is 1986, and the arcade classic Bubble Bobble has just released to huge amounts of acclaim and quickly became a massive success for Taito, who were the developers and publishers of the game. So with it being hugely popular, what do you think Taito did next? Well, they created a boatload of sequels and spin-offs, of course. We have Rainbow Islands, Paracel Stars, Bubble Bobble Part 2, not to be confused with Bubble Bobble 2, which is also called Bubble Symphony in certain regions. And of course we've got Puzzle Bobble, aka Bust-A-Move, which is probably the most popular Bubble Bobble spin-off, with it basically becoming its own separate series, which itself gained many ports and sequels of its own. You might be wondering why I'm reviewing Bust-A-Move 2 instead of the first game, and the only reason for that is because this is the only one that I own, and it's the one that I played as a kid. It turns out that Bust-A-Move 1 wasn't ever ported to the PS1, and with the PS1 being the first console that I ever owned, it kinda makes sense that I never got my hands on it. I only actually recently found out that Bust-A-Move 3 and 4 were ported to the PS1, but I've never played either of those, so we're sticking to Bust-A-Move 2 for this video. So what even is Bust-A-Move then? Well, the odds are you've actually already played a game like this, even if you've not played Bust-A-Move itself. It's one of those games that have been cloned many times in the past, with console games like Worms Blast, games you could play just by using your TV, like Beehive Bedlam, which was on Sky Games back in the day. Anyone remember that? And then more recently, mobile games like Bubble Witch Saga have once again popularised this style of puzzle game. But all of these examples are basically straight up rip-offs of Bust-A-Move, which was the game that started it all. If you've never played a game like this though, it's one of those things that's really simple to get to grips with, but has a fairly big skill ceiling if you want to master it. Kinda like Tetris or Puyo Puyo. So in Bust-A-Move you have a group of different coloured bubbles in different formations at the top of the screen, and the objective is to get rid of them all by popping them. The way you pop them is by lining up 3 or more of the same colour, which you do by shooting a bubble from your bubble cannon, which is placed at the bottom of the screen. Where it gets more complicated though is that you can actually create situations where a group of different coloured bubbles are all lined up on the screen, and you can pop the bubbles holding them up at the top of the screen, causing them all to drop down. clearing the screen of a huge amount of bubbles and giving you a higher score in the process. The thing is though, is that by lining the bubbles up like this and effectively clogging up your screen, you're actually risking your credits, because if the bubbles reach the very bottom, it's game over for you. Adding to the risk is the fact that after a while, all of the bubbles on the screen will be knocked down lower and lower, so you need to take this into consideration when being risky. There's also another element of time pressure too, because you can't wait too long or you'll automatically shoot whatever bubble it is that you've currently got in your cannon. So because of these elements, the pace of the game is kept very fast. If you want to get really good at the game, you'll also have to master doing complicated shots by bouncing the bubbles off of the walls of the stage. This is obviously very risky because aiming the bubbles like this is a lot more difficult than shooting them directly, so if you miss your shot, you might end up putting yourself in a very dangerous situation. All of these mechanics featured in the game have a good balance of risk versus reward, and I think that's one of the things that makes the game so addictive. There's also 2 different special bubbles featured in the game which affect the stages in different ways. The first is this shiny bubble, which when shot with a certain colour, it will eliminate all of the bubbles of that specific colour on the board. So you can be tactical with this and shoot it with a colour that's holding up a lot of other bubbles and get rid of loads of the board by using this. The second special bubble is actually really underutilised, to the point where I literally only encountered it 2 times in all my time playing the game for this review. But it's this cannonball which will destroy any bubbles it touches as it bounces around the screen. I can see why this isn't in the game much, to be honest, because it's a little bit overpowered, but still, why even have it there at all if you're going to use it this infrequently? It's a bit weird. And that's it. That's really all you need to know to play the entire thing. So you might be thinking based on that maybe the game is a bit lacking in content, but that's where it shocks you by showing you just how versatile this one simple idea is. The first mode in the game is Time Attack. This actually isn't featured in the arcade release of the game and was added into it for the PS1 release, pretty much making the PS1 version the most definitive version of the game. In Time Attack, the objective is to clear the screen of all bubbles as quickly as possible, and rather than registering a score, it instead registers your best time. While this is obviously somewhat similar to the standard modes of the game, this little tweak to the standard objective makes you think slightly differently about what you're doing, and it's a pretty good mode to play to get warmed up. It's also playable with a friend as well, but it's far less competitive than the main game because you can't send each other bubbles, and it's more so just exactly the same as playing it alone, but with the added pressure of having someone else there attempting to do it faster than you in real time. The second mode is the player versus player mode, which is the standard multiplayer option for the game. This is easily the most competitive and intense mode of the game, providing you're playing it with someone of a similar skill level. And it kinda feels like this was the focus of the entire game. Basically, this mode has you survive for as long as possible, and the last person remaining wins. The catch is that you can send your opponent garbage bubbles if you pop the bubbles in a chain of more than 3. So the more bubbles you pop in a single shot, the more bubbles get sent to your opponent, which can potentially completely screw up their strategy. Because the bubbles on the board are randomised every time you play it, it's different with every single match you have, which adds to the replayability. And this is the mode of the game that gives you that, oh, just one more go sort of mentality that all good puzzle games have. The third mode of the game is one of the 2 main single player options, and this one is the puzzle mode. Here you start the game on a grid and can choose one of 2 directions to progress to the top of the screen. Each time you move on the grid, you enter a set of 5 levels to complete, and by finishing them, you get to move one more space up the grid in any direction. The levels in this mode actually aren't randomised and have been designed by the developers of the game, which can lead to some interesting situations where you need to more closely examine the formations of the bubbles. Because normally there'll be a set way that you're supposed to pop them to maximise efficiency. Because of this mode feels extremely different to the other modes, and the pace is a lot slower, which adds a nice bit of variety to the game. Upon reaching the top of the grid and finishing the last set of stages, you actually get an ending cutscene, which simply states, "You are now king." So wait, all this time we were popping all of these bubbles and travelling up this grid in order to become a king? Who knew? Yeah, it's a little bit weird how suddenly there's an implication that there's a story to the game, considering it hasn't mentioned any plot details at all up until this point. Come to think of it, while it is completely unnecessary, I would have actually liked to have seen some sort of story going on in the background here. It could have been something as stupid as a competition set within the Bubble Bobble universe, and the winner gets a big cake or something. I feel like even that would have added a little bit of charm to the game that's missing here. When you finish puzzle mode and you get the "You are now king" ending, you're actually shown a cheat code which, when entered on the title screen, activates a sort of New Game Plus mode where you go through a grid of different levels where the backgrounds all look like Bubble Bobble levels, which is a pretty cool reward. Let's take a break for a second to look at the cover art for the game. Looks perfectly normal, right? Maybe it could have done with having Bub on there or something to make it more obviously Bubble Bobble related, but it does its job perfectly fine. Now, let's take a look at the American cover art. Okay, what the hell is going on here? This cute game about colourful dinosaurs popping bubbles and having a good time is being advertised to us with this absolutely horrific image of a man trapped in a bubble floating around a hellscape with his eyes forced open with sticks, cursed to never blink again and forever be tormented in the bubble void dimension. I mean, not only does this not reflect the game at all, but it's so far in the other direction, it's insane. It makes it look like a horror game. Apparently the American PS1 version was supposed to use the same cover art as the European release, but due to a mix-up they accidentally replaced the cover art with a magazine advert for the game, which is what we're looking at now. How in God's name anybody could possibly make a mistake of this scale, I have no idea, but whoever did this probably made it so the game performed extremely poorly in America. But still, it's an incredibly interesting piece of gaming history, and this cover art has gone down in infamy as one of the worst box art covers ever made. The cover art for Super Bust-A-Move for the PS2 is also really goddamn strange. This series just seems to love promoting itself with really weird box art, huh? The final mode of the game we have left to talk about is what I consider to be the main mode of the game, and it's the player versus computer mode. This is basically exactly the same as the player versus player mode, but rather than being against an actual person, you're against a CPU opponent. What makes this so good though is that you go against a really good variety of characters, which all have these really cute opening cutscenes which show them interacting with Bub. All of the different boards that you face the enemies on all have different backgrounds too, which is something I've actually not touched on much. The backgrounds of the levels are all really great and there's a lot of variety with them. Some of them are more abstract, whereas some are these nice looking landscapes of places like beaches or towns at night. And this is very important considering that without these backgrounds you'd basically be looking at the same thing in every level of the game and it would get boring very fast. But anyway, going back to the characters in the game, another little detail I loved is how the sprites at the bottom of the screen during the actual gameplay are animated and they'll be reacting to what's happening in the game, becoming nervous when the bubbles are low or celebrating when they're beating their opponents, and every character is different too, making it really interesting to see how they react to things. The biggest issue I have with this, and potentially my biggest issue with the entire game to be honest, is that you can't play as any of these other characters. Player 1 is Bub and player 2 is Bob, and that's it. Why didn't they make it so that when you beat one of these characters in the player versus computer mode, you unlocked them and then could play as them in the other modes of the game? That would have given the game a good element of progression as well, because as it stands, you're kinda playing the game and it never feels like you're actually doing anything. Don't get me wrong, the game does save your scores to a memory card, but that's all there is to do. Obviously it's based on an arcade game, so this makes sense, but they could have put in a tiny bit more effort into the console ports and made it so that you could play as the other characters, right? Like, the animations and everything are already there, all they needed to do was swap out the sprites. Anyway, going back to the actual game now, I don't know if it's just me, maybe I just suck or something, but this mode of the game is insanely difficult. I think the element of randomness with how the bubbles are laid out, the computer players becoming increasingly more difficult, and the fact you can only have a maximum of 9 credits, and if you lose them all you have to start all the way from the beginning again, is what causes this difficulty. But I'm being serious, this is probably the most difficult experience I've had with a game in a long time. It took me about 3 hours to finish this mode, and bear in mind too, I was only playing on the normal difficulty. There's a friggin' hard difficulty to go through as well, but you can screw yourself if you think I'm even attempting that. The final boss of this mode is pretty damn cool though. You get this awesome cutscene showing a warning on the screen as a spaceship descends and grows arms while Bub cowers in fear, and then the boss begins and the ship has this huge metallic cannon, which is the only time anyone has had a custom cannon like this. Then the music starts and it's way better and more dramatic than it has any right to be, and it gets you pumped up for a massive fight. Just listen. Then finally, you'll beat the boss and the ship explodes, only to reveal the pilot is the last boss from Bubble Bobble. Then a second phase begins against them. So not only do we have an epic opening with a warning signal and a boss fight with epic music against a foe with a custom bubble launcher, but it's also a multi-phase fight as well. I don't know why they made this boss so epic, but it's so unnecessarily amazing that I love it. I'm not gonna lie to you, after all of my failed attempts to get to this point, upon finally getting to the final boss and facing them in the last showdown, I was literally sweating. That's how you know you've gone above and beyond with your puzzle game. After beating the final boss, you get a little cutscene showing Bub being happy looking at the stars while his foe is knocked out on the floor. It's good stuff, but again, why didn't we have any kind of proper storyline here? Like, we could have had something going on where Bub had to make his way up a mountain to reach some cake, but to get there he needs to get through all of his enemies, and then as he reaches the cake, that's when the spaceship lands. Anything would have been better than the literal nothing we have in the actual game. What's interesting here though is that in the credits sequence we see a couple of characters that I actually didn't come across in the game. So I assume that these other characters are featured in the hard difficulty, which is really cool that they added more characters instead of just making the CPU better without changing anything else. Other than the lack of story and there being no character selection though, is there anything else I've got to complain about with this game? Well, actually, yeah there is. What content we have here is really good, but I do feel like a few more game types would have made it feel like a more complete experience. One particular mode I think would have been incredibly interesting is a co-op mode, where 2 people play at the same time and are working together to clear a single board. Maybe each person can't reach a certain area of the board or something, and maybe there could have been special bubbles which affect the other player's half of the screen or something. I feel like they could have come up with some really interesting ideas based on this, and I'm not actually sure if this was even featured in any of the later games of the series either. I also think that there could have been more special bubbles which interact with the board in different ways. Like I said earlier, there's only 2 special bubbles in the whole game, and it feels like they could have come up with far more than this to spice up the gameplay even more. They could have even made it so that the enemy characters used a certain type of special bubble more than the others, which would have given them a more distinct playstyle for you to overcome. But still, the only real negative points I have here are the lack of story, underutilization of special bubbles, maybe it could have done with a few more modes like the co-op mode, and the fact that you can't unlock or play as the other characters featured in the game. So really, that's not too bad. I don't even mind the fact that you can't have unlimited lives either, because I actually think that adds a degree of challenge that otherwise wouldn't be there. It even has a few little extras hidden away in the options menu too, most prominently of which is the music and sound test options, which allow you to listen to all of the music and sound effects in the game at your leisure. I always love it when games do this, even though it is pretty pointless nowadays because you can just find everything on YouTube anyway, but still. I do kinda wish that you had to unlock the music tracks by playing the game though. Again, this would have given the game more of a feeling of progression and satisfaction for completing it, but that's kind of nitpicking at this point. Speaking of the music in the game, I've actually not touched on just how good it is. It perfectly fits the vibe the game is going for with its colourful characters and vibrant backgrounds, and it just does a good job of really hitting home that Japanese arcade machine feel. Without this, the game wouldn't have anywhere near as strong of an identity as it has, so it's worth briefly touching on it here. So yeah, I really like Bust-A-Move 2, and I think it's up there among the very best puzzle games. If you've never played it, you should give it a go, and the good news here is that you don't even need to have a PS1 or any older consoles to do it, because Bust-A-Move 2 is available on modern consoles too for really cheap. It's on PS4, Xbox One, and the Nintendo Switch in the form of Puzzle Bobble 2. I don't know why it uses the Japanese name, but I don't mind this because like I said at the beginning of this video, I actually prefer that name anyway. The port on modern consoles is the Neo Geo version, which is a really faithful replication of the original arcade game. So it does lack some of the features from the PS1 version I've reviewed, but still, the core of the game is still there. So by all means give it a go if it looks appealing to you, because I feel like this series has kind of flown under the radar for most people, despite its clones becoming insanely popular. And that's Bust-A-Move 2 for the PS1. It's taken around 3.5 years to finally getting around to making a video on this, but I've done it. Are you happy now, bub? Of course you are. I don't think I'll be taking a look at any of the other Bust-A-Move games released in the series, just because they're probably all quite similar to the one that I've just reviewed. That being said, there is a possibility that in the future I'll take a look at some of the other Bubble Bobble games released in the series, because some of them are seemingly quite obscure, so I think that would be an interesting thing to tackle. There's also the somewhat recently released Bubble Bobble 4 Friends that I could check out, so you'll have to let me know down in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. Until then though, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like, subscribe to see more stuff like this coming soon, and until next time, bye!